The starter is just out of the refrigerator where it's been sitting for the last several days. I'm going to dump 1/2 of the starter. It just goes down the drain. Some people cook it, but I just toss mine. And then the starter needs to be fed. I use 75 grams of flour. I zero out the scale first, and that way I can measure out my 75 grams. I'm using whole wheat flour. You can use white flour, rye flour, a combination of flours, whatever works for you. And then I'll be adding 75 grams of water. So with the flour and water added, it needs to be stirred thoroughly. I happen to use a old chopstick. You can use whatever you want. Just makes sure that it's thoroughly mixed. I mark the level of the newly fed starter with a piece of tape so that I can tell how much it has increased in volume. Normally, at room temperature for mine, it will take approximately 2 hours before it doubles in volume. But you do want it doubled in volume so that you know it's active. So you can see here, it's been 2 hours, and I, in fact, have twice the volume that I had before we started. So now my starter is fully active and ready to be used. At this point, we're going to do the step called autolyse. It's simply a matter of mixing your flours and the water. There are no other ingredients added at this time. So in goes all the flour, in goes all the water, and it gets mixed very, very thoroughly. I'll use my scraper to begin folding it in on top of itself. The idea is that you want all of this flour incorporated so it's uniformly wet. Sometimes you'll find flour sticking on the bottom or on the sides. Just keep flipping it over and over until it's fully incorporated. Normally this takes about 1.5 to 2 minutes. It's not a very long process. This dough is really, really wet. It's very sticky. You can do this with your hands. I prefer to use the scraper. It just makes it a little less mess to clean up later on. Continue flipping it over until you get all of that flour incorporated, that there's no dry flour left in the bowl. It's really important that you get all of that flour fully incorporated. It only causes problems if you don't, so make sure that it's all in there. I want to get all the flour off my fingers so that I don't waste any of this dough. It makes such great bread. The next thing we're going to do is cover this, and it's going to rest for 45 minutes. So once all that dough's off there, I grab a piece of plastic wrap, cover it, and it will rest for 45 minutes. After the 45-minute rest, you'll notice no change at all in it, except the flour is now fully hydrated. It's had a chance to start to form the gluten strands that become vital in the bread being what it is in the finished product. So, get the bowl and the auto-leased flour back on the scale, zero it out, and we're going to add 75 grams of starter. This is all done by weight. The proportions are vital. Measuring it in fluid ounces doesn't work. The weight is the best way to do it to get consistent, reliable results. So don't cut short on that. Once the starter's in, we're going to add our 2 teaspoons of salt. I suppose I could weigh out how much 2 teaspoons of salt weighs, but I have never done that. I just know that 2 teaspoons is perfect for this size boule. Now we begin the arduous process of mixing all of our ingredients together. This is going to take a while. It feels like you're dealing with drying concrete. It's really thick, it's really heavy, it has no elasticity at this point, but we want to get it thoroughly mixed. Once it's all mixed, it's going to rest covered again for 30 minutes, and then it'll get mixed again. It will rest again for 30 minutes and get mixed again. I'll show you some abbreviated versions of that in just a moment. The point is that the dough will change over time. You'll see it become more elastic, more stretchy. You'll see the gluten strands in it. And what we're doing is developing the flour to have the texture that we're going to want in the final product, and it just takes this time of resting and remixing. So the saran wrap gets back over the top. It will now sit for 30 minutes. We'll come back to it. It will have changed a little bit at this point. It will have risen a little. And from now on, I'm going to be doing the mixing by hand. I'll no longer use the scraper. I suppose you could use the scraper if you want. You can see that it stretches a little bit. It didn't in the previous step. As we continued to do this 4 to 5 times, it depends on your dough. White flour tends, if it's all white flour, it tends to go in 4 times. Adding whole wheat and or rye, heavier flours, can take longer. But it's that quick. You go around, you mix it, cover it, and it's going to rest for 30 minutes again. That was Whitney photobombing us just for a second. She always likes to get in if she can. So here comes another one. And you'll see as I'm pulling on this dough, see how stretchy it is at that point? It gets smoother, more elastic, more supple after each of these 30-minute rests and pulling. It's a good time to read a book. You've got time, or watch videos on other people making bread. I've learned so much watching from others. I encourage you to do the same. If you've not made starter before, you can make your own. You can get it from a friend. I'm always happy to share mine with anybody. It lasts for years if you feed it and keep it alive. There are lots of videos online to tell you how to make your own starter. There's lots of different recipes, different ways to do it. I encourage you to go seek those out. I'm not going to recommend anybody in particular. You'll find one that you like. It takes about a week to get your starter going for the first time, and then you have it for forever as long as you continue to feed it. Again, you can see the texture of the bread changes a little bit. It's getting a little smoother as it pulls over. So this whole sourdough process is a little more complicated than just making straight breads. It's worth the time and effort, but you do have to take the time and effort to do it. I do all of these steps the first day, and then I let mine rise overnight on the counter. Some people let it rise in the refrigerator. It doesn't much matter when you get to that point. I believe we have 3 more turnings and half-hour rests in between. It depends on the dough. It depends on the day. You do it by sight and by feel, but you can see that this is changing dramatically. So once around the bowl, put the cover back on. Go watch another bread video. Read another chapter or 2 of your book. Come back to it in 30 minutes. There's a dog in the corner. He's always hoping for something to fall off the edge of the island here. So you can see the dough's changing again. It really is developing the gluten the way it's supposed to happen. If you were to try to do anything with this dough before doing these turns and weights, you are not going to have success. You're not going to be happy with what you get. You have to take the time to do this. So if you're going to do sourdough, you have to make a commitment to it. It takes time. It's a little bit more effort, well worth it in the end. So a 30-minute rest. We're back once more. You can see how the dough has domed a little bit in there. It really is close to where it wants to be to get ready for its final rise. Look at that stretch. You can see the gluten in it. That's what allows it to stretch without tearing. we are going to cover it up. And it's now about 9 o'clock in the evening. I'm going to let it sit till 7 tomorrow morning. So it's 7 in the morning. I had a good night's sleep. The dough has more than doubled in volume. Mine sat out on the countertop. And again, I said, if you wanted to, if you need more time, you want it to rise slower, so you can certainly let it happen in the refrigerator. It will still rise, even though it's cold in the refrigerator. You can count on that. It's very much alive. So this is a point where we start to do a preliminary shaping of the boule. The dough is scraped out of the bowl. You can see that it's fluid and it's almost pouring out. You can see some of those bubbles in there. You'll see the long gluten strands pulling away from the side of the bowl. This dough is in very good shape. With sourdough, you don't have a guarantee of how it's going to come out. It's a living thing, and it can be different each time. But I'm pretty happy with the way the dough is looking at this point. So I'm going to turn it over on itself. That floured side is coming up. And we're just going to kind of get it into a general shape of the boule. It's not the finished shape that we're going to work with, but we want to get it in this spot, and it's going to rest for 30 minutes. So once it's in the shape that we want, we can set it aside, grab that piece of plastic wrap. It gets used over and over again, and it's going to sit for 30 minutes. While that's sitting, I'm going to get my bowl cleaned out. I've got some time to do that because I'm going to use the bowl to let it rise in later on. You'll see there's a towel in there. That's an old dish towel. It's been 30 minutes. The dough's had a chance to relax. We're now going to shape it into its final shape. So a little flour goes on the bench. A very little amount of flour on the bread. You don't want to put too much on. That might dry out your dough, and you've gone to a lot of work to get it this far, so don't dry it out by putting too much flour on it. The dough gets folded over on itself. This is my method of shaping the finished loaf. There are lots of other ways. You can certainly go online and look. I encourage you to do so. You'll find a way that works for you. This one works for me, so it's how I do it. Keeping a little flour on my fingers, it doesn't stick too much. You want to be gentle with this dough. You don't want to push out any of the air bubbles that you work so hard to get. And with the combination of the bench scraper and floured hands, you can get it into the final shape that you're going to need. If you're going to put it into a Benetton, that's a basket for dough to rise in. I don't have one. You can some of those are oblong. You can put it in more of a football shape. Mine's going to be round, and it's going back in the bowl where I mixed the dough to begin with. So I use my old dish towel that gets used only for bread. You can see some of the stains on it. It's been used for a long time. We want to get it into the shape of the bowl without too many wrinkles. There's going to be some, and that can't be avoided. And it gets generously floured. The point of all of this is so that the dough doesn't stick when it has to come out of the bowl. Later on, we're going to turn the bowl upside down, and we want the dough to fall right out and not be stuck to the towel. So once we're satisfied that that's a good shape, pick up the dough and flip it over so that it's just going to go upside down how it was on the bench. And that's it. I'm now going to flour the side of the loaf and additionally on the dish towel. That's to prevent it from sticking. We don't want to get flour necessarily on the dough at this point, but along the sides to prevent sticking from later on. So it now gets covered up. You don't need the saran wrap at this point, and it's going to sit for 2 hours. So towards the end of that 2 hours rising time, you're going to place a Dutch oven inside of your oven and preheat the oven with the Dutch oven in it for to 500 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 30 minutes. So our dough has risen nicely. We do a little finger test here to push in. If it springs back, your dough is in great shape to be ready to bake. If it collapses, you've overproofed it, you're going to have to fix that. I would go online to find the solution to it. I don't have time to deal with that right here, and if your finger stays in it, obviously it needs to proof a little longer. I use a pizza peel to flip this over. We've got to get the dough out of the bowl and the towel. You can use a cookie sheet, whatever works at your house. I just don't want to turn it right onto the bench. That's a long way for it to fall. The dough might collapse. So we gently lift our bowl straight up. You can see the nice round loaf that's formed underneath the towel, and if you floured it carefully, hopefully you believed me and did, because if you didn't, it's going to stick. I've had it stick and it tears the loaf. So gently get that off. Some people like to put more flour on their dough at this point or brush it off. I just like that feel of it. It's very soft. So I have a very hot Dutch oven that I'm pulling out. Do not burn yourself at this point. It's very easy to. Be careful. I'm going to now grab my lamb. You can use a very sharp knife to score the bread. It's important to go in about a ½ an inch or so. It gives the dough a place to go when it rises so the loaf doesn't crack and split. It gives you a nice look to it, but a sharp knife or razor blade, something very sharp to pull through it, and then lift the dough, drop it into the very hot Dutch oven. Don't burn yourself at this point, please. I have been burned more than once. Cover goes back on, into the oven, 500 degrees, where it's going to bake for 20 minutes. So it's now been 20 minutes. Let's take a look. We're going to slide it out. The bread is not done at this point. It looks pretty nice. You'll see when you pull the lid off, but it needs to bake further. The cookie sheet I've put down is to prevent the bottom from burning, because it's going to cook for another 10 to 20 minutes. Depends on your oven, depends on your loaf. If you don't use this cookie sheet for this last part, it's going to, it will probably burn. And the oven gets turned down to 450 degrees. And I will check it at 10 minutes and 15 minutes, and if it takes up to 20. So we'll come back and take a look at this when my timer goes off. At this point, it's been 20 minutes. I liked the way my bread looks. I'm going to turn the heat off on the oven and leave the door open for an additional 20 minutes. That allows the crust to get nice and crusty. You can sort of take it out and let it cool at this point, but it gives you a much better crust if you let it sit for 20 minutes or so. So once that 20 minutes is up, it comes out of the oven. You're going to see how nice this looks. It's got a beautiful dark brown color. I did get a little split in it. That's okay. I'm getting better at scoring my dough over time. That's a feel that I'm learning to acquire over time. Hopefully I will get better as time goes on. So it will rest for an hour. I do not want to cut into it. It's been an hour. I'm going to cut in and take a look at, I wish you could hear this because it crackles when you cut through it. It is such a nice crisp crust. You'll see the big holes in the bread. Lots of chew to this. The rye and the whole wheat gives it a great flavor, as well as the sourdough. My sourdough is not that sour tasting. It depends on how you feed it, on how sour it gets. Very beautiful crumb inside there. I'm really happy with this loaf. So hopefully you can do what I've done here. It's that simple. It just takes time and effort. It's worth the time. Enjoy.